Hello everybody, this is my belated video response to Preston Jacobs' most recent book club installment, the story of Bitterblooms. And sorry for this, it's taken me a while to post this up. As you can tell, we've had holidays here, and it's been fairly family oriented for me, so I haven't gotten a chance to get to this as quickly as I wanted to. But in any case, let me just preface this by saying I don't think any author is necessarily a 100% match for every reader, and this is a case where George R. R. Martin, even though I like him tremendously and I find his work very entertaining, he's not necessarily a 100% match for me. And for A Song of Ice and Fire, for example, you get these scenes with Catelyn Stark or Sansa or a variety of other characters where they're in this predicament and they just sort of wallow in it for a while and they feel bad, and he sort of explores that emotion, and it just doesn't really do it for me. And it's not to say he's any less of a writer or anything like that. It's just not the parts of his work that I enjoy. And for Bitterblooms, this really, unfortunately, the beginning of it really started out that way for me as well. You sort of get into this thing, and our protagonist, she's in this predicament, and it's like, oh, what am I going to do? And then self-pity and loathing, and then there's a spaceship, and I'm very interested, and I think, yes, now finally we're getting somewhere, to something interesting. And Preston, in his review of the story, he goes into a lot of the context from which the story is written and sort of explains the whole history of this imaginary world and why it is the way it is and all this stuff. But the story itself is not really self-contained, as in it doesn't have all this background for you to understand this story unless you've read all the other stories and you understand what's going on in the broader scheme of things. So if you read the story without all that added context, it becomes much more of a mystery. And I think this is important because it's very similar to A Song of Ice and Fire, and this is sort of the reason why at least this particular book club is getting into this, is because we're trying to give ourselves context for George R. R. Martin's written work to hopefully understand A Song of Ice and Fire better. So let me get into this a little bit. There are, I think, very few stories that truly combine science fiction and fantasy. And I think one example, at least one example that a lot of people have tended to point to, would be Star Wars, which is kind of the exception to that, where they had the Force, which is kind of the magical element in science fiction, obviously being the science element. That is until the prequels, where George Lucas very cleverly inserted the concept of midichlorians. And then we had this biological explanation for the Force, and everyone loved it so much, and the prequels were such a great hit. But anyways, I digress as usual. By and large, most genre fiction is going to fall into one or the other, and it doesn't really combine both. And Bitterblooms starts off purporting to be a fantasy story, and it ends up really being a science fiction story. And this has some interesting implications if we're trying to understand A Song of Ice and Fire better, because we have some of George R. R. Martin's work that sort of implies that he tends to write a certain way. And let me go back to the concept of the why, which I've talked about in my past videos. If you look, or if you took any kind of high school or college literature class, then you remember the traditional four types of conflict, which is man versus nature, man versus society, man versus man, or man versus himself. And a lot of people, when they're reading a story, either consciously or subconsciously, they'll sort of categorize these stories among these four different types of conflict. And in A Song of Ice and Fire, it's very easy to think of, is Bran going to survive his journey beyond the wall to the three-eyed raven, out in the cold and in the forest and everything? Or can Jon and Tyrion work past society's treatment of bastards and dwarves? Or is Varys going to triumph over Littlefinger, or vice versa? Or can Jaime work past his personal demons and accomplish, whatever? So, you can sort of look at Song of Ice and Fire and come up with examples of all these different kinds of conflict that I'm giving an example of here. But I think that George R. R. Martin uses these conflicts quite expertly to distract the readers from the why. And in Bitterblooms, I think he does this same thing. So in Bitterblooms, it would be very easy to read it and view it as a man versus man story, or really a woman versus woman story. And we think, is Sean going to figure out that she's being duped by Morgan, right? And if you just read it at a very basic level, that's really what the story is. But that's a very big distraction from the why, as in, why is there a spaceship in the middle of a fantasy world, right? And if you, Preston filled in the details for us, but if without that added context, that would be a huge open question that we'd be left to try to figure out, and would leave us wanting more. It's essentially the old magician's trick of, look at the right hand so you don't notice what the left hand is doing. And that's what George R. R. Martin does very consistently. And when we take this in the context of the Song of Ice and Fire, when we're busy focusing on the characters, we're not asking the why questions. And the biggest why questions, and I think this is essentially what Preston is really focusing on for his various video series, at least a lot of the recent ones, is if this is a fantasy story, then why is there no magic? And why are there a lot of other things that seem to be tied to science? Like, for example, the video series that Preston did on the genetics of dragon breeding seems to be a very compelling explanation, and there doesn't seem to be as compelling of an explanation that's an alternative, so it seems to be very science-based. So if it really is a fantasy story, why is there all this science? Or if it really is a science fiction story, then we have a whole other list of whys that we have to address. Like, for example, how did the wall get built? Or why did the glass candles suddenly start working, and how do they work? There must be some scientific explanation for that. Or why does dragon glass work so effectively against the others? And obviously the big one that lots of people like to talk about is, why is there the long winters, the irregular winters, irregular seasons? Why does this happen? So that's really all the thoughts that I had on this. But just keep that in mind. I think reading through the rest of the stories in the book club, is George R. R. Martin's extremely good at writing these characters and very interesting stories. But don't let that distract you from the whys, which tend to happen a lot in the settings. Examine the settings and see what we can derive from it. Okay, thanks guys, and we'll see you next time.